The morning felt like any other. The sun filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the living room where Sarah prepared breakfast. She hummed as she set the table, trying to ignore the soft hum of tension that had been building in the house for weeks. Her husband, Mark, sat at the kitchen counter, lost in his phone, his attention elsewhere. It wasn't unusual for him to be distracted, but Sarah had noticed a subtle shift in him recently. It wasn't just his quietness that unsettled her. There was a distance, a coldness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It made her wonder, though she refused to admit it to herself. "Mom, I'm gonna be late." Luke's voice broke through her thoughts. Sarah's stepson, a 17-year-old high school senior, was always in a rush. He barely looked at her as he grabbed his backpack and headed out the door. Sarah's attempts to engage him, even with a casual, "have a good day," were often met with little more than a grunt. Luke had been distant for months now, ever since Mark and Sarah's marriage started to feel like it was on shaky ground. She assumed it was the typical rebellious phase for a teenager, but something told her it was more than that. As she cleaned up after breakfast, Sarah's mind kept circling back to Mark. He'd been coming home late, his phone constantly buzzing with notifications he'd quickly swipe away. When they'd talk, he would brush off her concerns, telling her it was work or that he had a late meeting. She believed him for a while, convincing herself that his long hours were simply the price they had to pay for a comfortable life. But deep down, something didn't sit right. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The evening would come, and Mark would act as though everything was normal. They'd sit down for dinner, make small talk, and Luke would remain in his room, barely acknowledging them. Sarah was tired, so tired of pretending that everything was fine. But she wasn't ready to confront Mark yet. She wasn't ready to face the possibility that her marriage could be falling apart. So, she let the days pass by, clinging to the hope that it was all just a phase, that Mark would snap out of it, and everything would go back to normal. Luke's behavior continued to worsen. He no longer participated in family activities. He didn't even try to hide his frustration with Sarah anymore. She couldn't understand why he was so angry, why he had so much resentment building up inside him. She tried to talk to him, to reach out, but each attempt was met with cold silence or sharp words. He started staying at a friend's house more often, and when he did come home, he'd retreat to his room, shutting himself off from the world around him. Sarah knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what. And the more she watched him withdraw, the more anxious she became. Sarah couldn't pinpoint the moment she started suspecting Mark of infidelity. It wasn't a single instance, but a series of small signs. The way he'd get defensive when she asked simple questions. The way he seemed to always be busy, but couldn't explain what he was doing. The long hours at work that stretched late into the night. It all seemed so trivial at first, but together, they formed a picture Sarah didn't want to see. The gut feeling grew stronger, and though she pushed it away, it gnawed at her every day. One evening, after Mark had once again claimed he had to stay late at the office, Sarah found herself standing in front of the kitchen counter, staring at the unopened letter from his phone company that had been sitting there for days. She knew it was intrusive, but something inside her told her she needed to know. Her heart pounded as she opened it, eyes scanning over the details of the bill. There, in black and white, were the clues she'd been unconsciously searching for. Mark had been texting someone late at night, someone other than her. There were names she didn't recognize, numbers she hadn't seen before. Her hands trembled as the words began to blur on the paper, and her stomach sank. She felt dizzy, lightheaded, as the realization settled in. She wasn't imagining things. Mark was hiding something. But the real shock came when she noticed the timestamps, late-night conversations, texts that didn't make sense, and the frequency of them. The doubt that had slowly formed over weeks now had a face, a reality she couldn't ignore. She wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but a cold fear gripped her chest. What if he denied it? What if he had an excuse? Her mind raced with questions, but none of them could undo what she had just discovered. The love and trust she had for Mark felt suddenly fragile, slipping through her fingers. But Sarah wasn't the only one affected. Luke had been quiet for days now, more withdrawn than ever, and Sarah wondered if he already knew, if he had been feeling the tension between his father and herself long before she did. Sarah stood frozen, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her. She knew she had to face it, but she wasn't ready. Not yet. So, she folded the letter back up and shoved it into a drawer, hiding the truth from herself as much as she was hiding it from Mark. But the silence in the house grew louder, and Sarah couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to do something. But what? How could she confront the man she had trusted for so long? And more importantly, how could she protect Luke from this? The air in the house felt thick, suffocating. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending everything was fine. The cracks in the foundation of their family were widening, and Sarah was standing on the edge, unsure of what would happen when it all came crumbling down. It happened one afternoon when Mark was out of the house, his usual late meeting excuse hanging in the air. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her mind racing. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The doubts had turned into something undeniable, and now she had to face them. She had already found the messages, but she needed confirmation. She picked up his phone, the one he left lying carelessly on the counter. Her hands trembled, but there was no turning back. The truth had to come out, and she had to know if she was wrong, if she had been imagining things. Her heart pounded as she unlocked the phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she opened his text messages. It was there, right in front of her, conversations she hadn't seen before. Names she didn't recognize. Dates and times that didn't match up with anything he had told her. The exchange was casual at first, but as she scrolled further, it became clear. Mark wasn't just talking to someone. He was involved with someone else. Her chest tightened, and a sharp pain shot through her stomach. Her mind screamed for her to stop, to put the phone down, but she couldn't. Every word, every message was like a needle driving deeper into her heart. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't paranoid. Mark was having an affair. As the weight of the discovery hit her, Sarah's breath became shallow. She tried to hold back the tears, but they came anyway. She had spent years building this life, trusting this man, loving him, and now it was all falling apart. She didn't know what to do, how to react, or even what to say. The world around her felt as though it was spinning too fast, and for a moment, she just sat there, staring at the screen, numb to everything. The reality of what Sarah had discovered weighed heavily on her every waking moment. The discovery of the affair had shattered something inside her. She no longer recognized the man she had once trusted completely. But as devastating as the truth was, it wasn't just the betrayal from Mark that haunted her. It was the way it was tearing apart everything she had worked for. She had always hoped that, despite their ups and downs, her family would remain intact. Now that hope felt like a distant memory. She couldn't bear to confront Mark just yet. His empty apologies and hollow excuses were all too familiar, and Sarah was tired of hearing them. It wasn't just the infidelity that bothered her, it was his blatant disregard for the trust they had built. He hadn't even tried to hide the affair. The late-night texts, the secretive phone calls, the long absences, they all pointed to a deep dishonesty she could no longer ignore. Mark had chosen this. He had chosen someone else. And for Sarah, that was unforgivable. But the fallout wasn't just personal. Luke, her stepson, had been silent for days. He was distant, colder than usual, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something was wrong. He had always been perceptive, too perceptive for his own good. Sarah couldn't help but wonder how much he had seen, how much he had suspected. She knew how hard it was for him to adjust to the blended family dynamic, but now, with the infidelity hanging over them, things were even more complicated. One evening, after dinner, when Sarah tried to make small talk, Luke snapped at her. His anger wasn't just directed at her, it was everything that had been building up inside him. "Why are you still with him?" he asked, his voice shaking with frustration. "Why do you keep pretending everything's fine? You know he's not being honest with you." The words hit Sarah like a slap across the face. She had tried to protect Luke, to shield him from the pain of her failing marriage, but now he was confronting her with a raw honesty she wasn't ready for. She could feel the weight of his disappointment in her. He had been watching her, watching her silently put up with Mark's lies, and now he couldn't understand why she wasn't taking a stand. The anger in his eyes was clear. He was tired of pretending too. "Luke, I don't know what you think you know, but—" Sarah started, but he cut her off. "No, you don't get it.
I can see it, Mom.
I see how he treats you. How he's treating us. Why do you keep letting him get away with it?" His voice cracked, and Sarah could see the hurt in his eyes. The hurt that she had tried to protect him from, but now it was too late. He had already felt the betrayal in his own way, even if he didn't understand all the details. The tension in the room was unbearable, and Sarah felt completely powerless. She didn't have the answers Luke needed, and she didn't know how to explain to him that she was struggling just as much as he was. "I'm trying, Luke," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm trying to figure out what to do." Luke's eyes hardened. "You need to make a choice, Mom. You can't keep living like this. We both deserve better." His words cut deeper than anything Mark had said or done. Sarah had always tried to be strong for Luke, to make sure he felt loved and secure in the family. But now, she realized that her own decisions were causing him pain. She wasn't just failing her marriage, she was failing him too. Her heart ached as she watched him retreat to his room, the door slamming behind him. She knew she had to make a choice. She had to confront Mark, even if it meant facing the consequences head-on. But what if she didn't have the strength to do it? What if confronting him would only tear the family further apart? The uncertainty gnawed at her. It felt like everything she had built was crumbling, and no matter how hard she tried to hold on, it seemed to slip further away. That night, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house around her. The silence felt suffocating. Luke's words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't escape the harsh reality. No matter what she did, no matter what decisions she made, things would never be the same. And the hardest part was knowing that it wasn't just her life that had been affected by Mark's betrayal, it was Luke's too. And that thought broke her heart more than anything else. Sarah couldn't escape the gnawing sense of urgency any longer. The emotional storm that had been building for weeks was finally reaching its peak. Mark had been acting as if nothing had changed, as if his betrayal had not shattered everything. But Sarah could no longer play the role of the oblivious wife, pretending that the cracks in their marriage weren't widening with every passing day. She had spent too long clinging to the hope that things would get better on their own. But the truth was inescapable now. Mark had crossed a line, and their family, their trust, was on the verge of destruction. The decision was made. She couldn't go on like this. For her own sanity, for Luke, and for whatever was left of their family, she had to confront him. The affair had already broken the bond between them, but Sarah was determined not to let it completely define her life. She had always prided herself on her independence, but now, it felt like she was drowning in a marriage built on lies. She confronted Mark that evening, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. There was no hesitation now. "I know, Mark. I know about the affair," she said, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. His reaction was one she had predicted: guilt, defensiveness, and ultimately, the same hollow promises. But Sarah was done listening to them. His apologies felt empty. They had always been empty. He had betrayed her trust too many times for her to believe his words now. "You think I don't know what you've been doing?" Sarah continued, her voice firm. "You've been lying to me, and worse, you've been lying to Luke. I don't know what I thought, but I can't pretend anymore. Not for you, not for me, not for anyone." Mark tried to explain, tried to convince her that it was a mistake, that it was over, that he was sorry. But Sarah had heard it all before. She wasn't interested in his excuses anymore. She didn't want to hear about his guilt or regret because it didn't change anything. The damage had been done, and no amount of words would undo it. "I don't want your apology, Mark," she said, her voice cold. "I want you to face the consequences of your actions. I want you to understand that this isn't something you